at verse 19. So let me kind of just remind us where we have been, especially since we took a week off. So I mentioned in chapter 6, we're really looking at hypocrisy in general. And in verses 1 through 18, we really focused on hypocrisy in our relationship to God, hypocritical religion, if you will. We really focused on our relationship with him. We talked about prayer and almsgiving and fasting. And now we move to the second section of this, really in verse 19 through the end of the chapter, which is really about our life in this world. If the first part was our religious life, this is really our world life, our life in the world, and our relationship to the world. And of course, the order of those two things is important, right? We've got to get our relationship to God straight before we can talk about our relationship to the world. And one of the main things I want to talk about is being on time and making sure that we're not late coming to class.
We were greedy.
You're dedicated to it.
We had a job.
This is my past. Hey, Rich.
Yeah.
Here I said, we are 10 minutes late every week. I said, we would just start 10 minutes late. I reached for my phone. I want to show a picture. I have my phone. And then Melanie reached her pocket. She said, I don't have mine either. And she said, should we turn around? I said, no. We have never been anywhere. Nobody had a phone. I'm proud of her.
I understand.
Right.
Hey, listen, I really appreciate you guys getting here.
There you go.
All right. So again, in verse 19 and following, it really is about our relationship to the world. We know that verse that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. It really is about getting our spiritual life in order, and then the life that we live with the rest of the world. And then from verse 19 to the end of the chapter, it really is about this relationship with the world. But there are two pieces to that. Verses 19 through 24, we'll be really looking at the love of the world. And then in 25 through the end of the chapter is really about our anxiety over the world, or our dependence on the world. And so we'll be looking at that. I've mapped out for us to try to do verses 19 through 24 this morning. We'll see if we can actually pull that off, because it really is one lesson. It really is one thing that he's trying to get across to us. And one thing we need to think about ahead of time is, what do you spend most of your time thinking about? What do you spend most of your time worrying about, striving for, thinking about? What's on your mind most of your time? So look at verses 19 and 20, and I want to read it in an abridged version. Verse 19, it says, do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth. And then in verse 20, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven. I want to deal with that part first before we get into the rest of it, because what you have there is a statement by Christ telling us not to lay up treasures on earth, but to lay up treasures on heaven, lay up treasures in heaven. Now, what's incredible is that that's really all he had to say. With the rest of all the rest of the pieces of this, but between this and verse 24, is kind of reasons for doing so, reasons for laying up treasures in heaven and not on earth. What's incredible is that Jesus doesn't have to do that. He's the boss. He's the king. He gets to decide, right? And when he says, lay up treasures on earth and don't lay up treasures in heaven, that ought to be enough for us. But he is so gracious that he gives us reasons behind it. He gives us explanations for it, which, it's just amazing that he does that, really. I just got to say up front. Now, when we look at verse 19, and it says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, we got to figure out what the treasures are that he's talking about. And I got to say right up front that the commentaries here, I don't like a lot of the commentaries here because a lot of the commentaries and a lot of the preaching that I looked at focuses here on money, right? When he talks about laying up treasures in heaven, it's about focusing on money. And certainly money is a key component of your treasure. But I think that God has a broader message that he wants to teach us here about our treasures and about the things that we treasure when he says lay up treasures on earth. Do not lay up treasures on earth, but lay up treasures in heaven. So it's at least money. I don't want to throw that away. He is talking about your money, and particularly your excess of money. But he's also talking about your attitudes towards that money, right? He's also talking about your stuff that you have bought with money, all the things that you treasure. But then I would also add that he's also talking about the attitude towards your life in this world. In other words, things like your job, your reputation, what's important to you, your house, your family, the praise of men, your self-sufficiency, others' opinions of you. So when we talk about what are the things that we treasure, it goes far beyond just cash, right? And it really has to do with all the things that we think are important, the things that you're interested in, the things that you hope for. I would ask this question: what are you proud of? Right? What is the list of things that comes into your mind when you think, what am I proud of? Is it your family? Is it your job? Is it your what? Right? All these things are treasures on earth. So when he says don't lay up for yourself treasures on earth, what are the things that you're treasuring in this world? What are the things that are important to you in this world? One of the commentaries said, don't waste your talents on earthly things. Kind of like that statement. So I would ask you as we start this lesson, what are the treasures? What are your treasures? What are you storing up? So with that kind of broad understanding of treasures, let me ask the next question. What does it mean to lay up treasures on earth? What does it mean for us to lay up treasures? He said, do not lay up treasures on earth. Let me just pause and see if you've got a thought on that. What does it mean to lay up treasures on earth?
I've got a note in my Bible that says it's a choice between activities that lead to greater reward in the present and those that store up greater future reward in heaven. So it's your daily actions. Where do you spend your time?
Good. Any other thoughts? What does it mean to lay up treasures on earth? I think Rick's going down the right path.
I was thinking excess. Over and above what you need. I don't think he expects you to, as a pauper or be poor, he blesses you with riches, but I think to me the word excess, when you talk about storing something up.
I think that's a part of it, yes.
I think it's the attitude of the heart towards anything.
Yeah, I think it's broad like that, Debbie. I agree. I think we can't lock it into a specific category of stuff, but it is our attitude towards those things. It includes that. Any other thought? That's good.
I think that when you do things for other people, even though you may feel like you don't have the time or you have other things you want to do yourself, but it's important to help others that need help.
Yeah, I think what you're talking then now to the second part of laying up treasures in heaven. I agree. We'll get there. I'm trying to figure out what is the mistakes that we make in laying up treasures on earth. What are those things? What are we doing that is that looks like laying up treasures on earth?
I think to me, it just means that you're making things of this earth more important. They're priorities are more important than whatever you should be doing for God.
Yeah, I think that's good. The word prioritize, I think, is a good word, right? You're prioritizing the stuff of this world, the success in this world, the attitude about things in this world above Christ, above his kingdom. You're relishing the praise of men for those things, right? For position, status, self-worth, all those things that we talked about. You're tempted by the world, right? The world entices you, and you lay up those treasures by responding to those enticements. All right, so let's get to Curtis's point and look at verse 20, right, where he says, "Lay up for yourself treasures in heaven." So, what are those treasures in heaven? What are the treasures in heaven that you should be storing up, that you should be laying up?
Our job here is to spread the gospel. That's the treasures. Bring other people, showing other people Christ, being salt and light.
Good.
Your efforts to reach other people, to reach the world.
Yep.
To train your children and grandchildren properly.
Good. Let's look at a couple of verses. What you've said is great, but let's look at a couple of verses. In 1 Timothy chapter 6. Verse 17. 1 Timothy 6:17. So it says, "Command those who are rich in the present age not to be haughty." So let me just stop right there. Command those who are rich. Look around the room and recognize that he's talking about you, right? You who are rich, right? You who are rich in not only money, but resources, in abilities, in talents, in respect, in all the things that make up who you are incredibly rich. So don't just think about, he's talking about Elon Musk here. He's talking about you, and certainly compared to the rest of the world, this group is incredibly rich, right? So let's go back to it. Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life. So what does he tell us here? He's telling us, with the riches that you have, let them do good. Let them be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share. Right? So when we talk about laying up treasures in heaven, right, that's what he says in verse 19, storing up for themselves a good foundation in the time to come. He's talking about using the treasures that you have here on earth for others. Using the treasures that you have here on earth for others. And again, treasures, not just money, because he talks here about good works, ready to give, willing to share. It's the acts that you do. It's the way that you interact with others. Look at Matthew chapter 25. You know this verse, this section very well. You know what? I have got an old version of my notes here. Hold on. Please stand by. Because I know I'm missing pieces that I added last night as I was studying this. Let's see if I can find the newer version. I don't know if this is the same or another version. We'll see when we get to it. All right. Now I got to find my place. Yeah. 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 Okay. This is better. That's weird. I don't know why I had an old set. Where were we? Matthew 25, right? So you know this in verse 31. You know this story in verse 31 and following that Jesus talks about. I want to skip all the way down to verse 36. Right? It says, "I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick, you visited me. I was in prison, you came to me." And then the righteous will answer him and saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger, take you in and naked and clothe you? When do we see you sick and in prison and come to you?" And the king will answer and say to them, "Assuredly, I say to you, as much as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me." Right? So again, this idea of us giving, us doing, us acting on behalf of others is the way that we store up treasures in heaven. Right? I want to see one more in John chapter 6. John chapter 6, verse 27, one little verse. John 6:27, "Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of God will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him." Right? Don't labor for food that perishes, but for the food that endures. Now, essentially what these verses are saying, as we are generous with our treasures here on earth, we're storing up rewards in heaven. As we're generous with our treasures here on earth, we're storing up rewards in heaven. And again, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, right? It's okay to store up rewards. It's okay to be doing things for rewards. Christ did exactly the same thing, and you should be doing the same thing now. Being generous with our treasures and to store up rewards in heaven. Why? Well, we get into that in a few minutes. But now I'll ask this question. How do we do that? How do we get our minds in the right place such that we can act in this way? I want you to turn for a minute to Hebrews chapter 11, that famous chapter in Hebrews. Famous faith chapter. I just want to show you a couple of attitudes of people who are talked about here in verse 11. We'll start at verse 9. Hebrews verse 11, chapter 11, verse 9. Hebrews 11:9. Here's talking about Abraham. It says, "By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him in the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God." Skip over to verse 14. 14 is talking about these all. It says, for those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And then in verse 24, we see it again, talking about Moses. It says, "By faith Moses, when he came of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward." So you see here in all these cases, when we talk about the great faith of these patriarchs, right? One of the things that they point out is that all of them had a picture of a future home, of a home somewhere else. And I think this is a critical mindset for us as when we think about our putting up treasures in heaven, is recognizing that what we're actually doing is storing up our treasures for home. We're putting them at home. We're storing them at home so that when we get home, those treasures will be there. The rewards for those treasures will be there. I think that mental thinking is really important for us. That that don't think about storing up treasures here. They're not going to last. They're not going to be around. You're not going to be around, right? Why don't you store them up in some place where they will be forever, where they will be eternally? We are only stewards in this place. We're only stewards of these things for a passing time. So our thinking ought to be, how can I use these things for the glory of God? How can I use these things to further his kingdom? I'm a child of God placed here for his purpose, not mine. All right, I got to take a little side road here, and I'll probably get in trouble by doing so, but it's because it's about politics. When you think about your political views, I got to ask you, why do you hold those political views? Are they for treasure on earth or treasure in heaven? Are you protecting something in this world or trying to get something in this world through your political views? And I know I'm not getting there yet. How much of your feelings are attached to your political views? Is there bitterness or anger or passion that's connected to your political views that are about earthly success or heavenly success? Is it about trying to prove a point here on earth or trying to prove a heavenly point? Is it about trying to win here on earth or trying to win in heaven? Do you look on political conversations as a pilgrim that you're just passing through, or are you controlled by those political thoughts, conversations, mindsets? Is it all you can talk about? Is it all that's in the news for you? Or are you just a pilgrim passing through and you're watching and you're saddened by these things? It's just something that came to mind as going through here. I just needed to pass on. All right. I'll just leave that there and let you ponder it. Now, let's go back to verse 19 and 20. Because as I said, Jesus begins to give us some great reasons why we should lay up treasures in heaven and not on earth, right in the midst of his discussion. So verse 19 says, "Do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. Lay up for yourself treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal." So one thing I've got to say, you know what moth are, right? Moths. I can't say that word, obviously. It's like donkey. I can't say that word either. Moths are, right? They tear apart garments. See, one thing you got to recognize is in these days, there were two things that were very important commodities to these people. One was their garments, right? To have a fine robe, to have a fine outer garment, that was very important to these folks. The other thing that was very important to them was grain, right? Was their food and those kinds of products. Although they did have coin that they used for buying and selling, the things that were actually very important to them was their clothing, their garments, and their food sources, right? So when it talks about moths and rust, the word rust is actually a very poor translation of the Greek word. Does anybody have another word for rust in their Bible? I'm just curious.
The NIV says vermin.
It's a moth and rust and worm consume and destroy.
Good. So what's interesting is the word rust doesn't even make any sense in this context. because, they didn't have automobiles that rusted, right? They didn't have steel in these days, right? I mean, there was some fundamental iron and such, but rust would not be something that they would deal with in their housing and stuff. But having vermin or worms to eat their food, their grain, would be something very important to them. So here it would be really much better to say, where moths and rats would consume them. I think would be a much better translation of what the Greek is actually saying here, because the word in the Greek is actually eaten instead of rust. It's being eaten away, and they've connected it to metal, but it really should be connected to the food sources that they had at that time. Anyway, that's just kind of an aside. So moth and rust, something that is tearing up their what they're putting aside, what they're saving for themselves. And the whole point is that all earthly things are perishable, right? All earthly things eventually will deteriorate and go away. And if we're putting our trust in those earthly things, those things are going to go away. They're perishable, or they can be stolen. And stolen is a general word, right? Which means that somehow they can go away. They can cease to be there. They can be taken by others. Or, it's interesting in these days, right? We've got identities that can be stolen. Certainly your health can be stolen. Eventually your whole life is stolen by death. And so when we think about anything that we put our trust in now, that we put our treasure in now, all those things are going to go away, whether it's even yourself, right? If you trust in yourself and how wonderful you are and how incredible you are, right? All of that goes away eventually. And these things never fully satisfy. All these things that we put our trust in, that we put our treasure in. But look at what he says, about the things in heaven, right? Neither moth nor rust destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. These are things that last. So look at 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. Just to remind you of these things. 1 Peter 1, 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible, undefiled, that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God through faith and salvation, etc., right? But the inheritance is incorruptible, undefiled, does not fade. So again, it's just what we've said before. As we build up treasures in heaven, those treasures in heaven do not go away. They do not fade. They are not corruptible. Moth and rust cannot get to them, right? Now, go back now to Matthew chapter 6. Because now we have three statements Jesus makes, which really are an extension of what he's been saying here about laying up treasures in heaven rather than laying up treasures in earth. I want to say that in a different way. I want to say it this way: love God rather than loving the world, right? Lay up treasures in heaven rather than laying up treasures on earth. Really means love God rather than loving the world. What we have in verses 21 through 24 are three statements about this treasure. So look at verse 21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Notice here he's focused on the heart. I'm going to quickly go through these and then come back and talk about them. Verse 22, the lamp of the body is the eye, and therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. And therefore the light that is in you is darkness. How great is that darkness? These two verses are really talking about the information that we get, or the mind, right? The mind is darkened and we don't get the information. We'll get into that in detail. So first we're talking about the heart in verse 21. Verse 22 and 23, we're talking about the mind. And then verse 24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. No one can serve God and mammon. When we talk about serving, we're talking about the will, right? We're talking about those decisions that we make to serve or not to serve. So here in verses 21 through 24, we have the heart, the mind, and the will. Okay? So let's look at that a little bit more closely. In verse 21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This is the danger. There, where your treasure is, where you're spending your time, where you're spending your money, where you're spending your energy, that's where your passion is going to be. That's where your desire is going to be. That's where your love is, right? You're showing where your love is by where you are spending your treasures, where you are spending your time, your energy, your passion, your money. Go to this amazing verse in John chapter 3. John chapter 3, verse 19. John 3:19, mine says, and this is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than the light, because their deeds were evil. Men love the darkness. Men love the darkness. We have convinced ourselves that we only like the world when actually we love the world. Right? We're not really putting treasures on the world, but actually we are. Right? We think, oh no, it's just kind of an aside for me, this whole world thing, when actually it's a focus. And that's exactly what he's pushing against here. Where your treasures are, where you're spending your time, your energy, your money, that is showing your love. That is showing where your heart is. And just for your reference, Proverbs 4, verses 20 and following, talk about guarding your heart, right? Guarding your heart. So the first statement here he's saying is your heart, which, and I would say in this context, he's really talking about your passions, your emotions, your desires, right? That part of your heart that loves, he's saying you got to guard that and make sure that your treasures are they're impacting your heart. They're showing the reality of your heart. All right, let's look at verse 22. The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. Right? So the way we look at things, our focus is exemplified here by the eye. And he's saying that the eye is, mine says good, some will say single, some say healthy, some say clear. The whole point is that is your focus of your eye, the way that you look at things is critically important. If the lamp of the body is the eye, and if your eye is good, if you look at things in the right way, then your whole body, your whole mind, your whole thinking will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, if you look at things in the wrong way, your whole body, your whole mind, your whole thinking, your whole attitude, the way you approach everything will be full of darkness. The way we explain things to ourselves is critical for the way that we understand things. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3. Second Corinthians 4:3. Mine says, but even if your gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, whose minds the God of this age has blinded, who do not believe, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine on them. Right? So notice the minds, the God of this age, i.e. Satan, has blinded them, blinded them such that they cannot see. Their minds are blinded, right? This is the same thing that Jesus is saying here back in Matthew. Their minds are blinded such they cannot see. They cannot understand. Now, go back again to Matthew 6. That last statement is powerful. In verse 23, it says, if therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Boy, I got to tell you, I believe that this is a statement about humanity today, right? The man today believes that his mind will give him clarity, that he can figure it out, that he can use science, and science is going to tell him exactly what the right answer is, and we can figure everything out. We are rational beings, right? But this says if his mind is dark, in other words, if his mind does not see the light of Christ, if his mind does not see God's truth, then everything is darkness. Everything that he believes, everything that he understands, everything that he rationalizes is wrong. He doesn't see the forces controlling his mind and twisting the truth. He doesn't understand that he is in darkness. Does this make sense? Do you get this?
Yes.
Satan has convinced man that denying God is rational. And therefore, because of the darkness in his mind, he has to come up with all kinds of explanations of everything else, which are all based on darkness. That's exactly what this is saying. If therefore the light that's in you, the understanding that's in you, what you understand to be true is darkness, is not truth, is not Christ, is not from God, how great is the darkness in you? How great is your understanding of all things, all relationships, all ways that things work? It's a powerful statement, I believe, on today's reality. All right, let's keep going. Verse 24. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. No one can serve God and mammon. I would say no one can serve God and the world, right? He's using mammon again, he's focusing on things, he's focusing on money, but it's really a story about the world. You can't serve God and the world. God, I'm going to say some things. God demands servitude. God expects us to be slaves to him. And it says here that you're going to hate one and love the other. Let's just look at a couple of verses. Look at Luke chapter 10. By the way, I'm going to ask you in a minute, how are you about being a slave? You okay with that? Luke chapter 10, verse 27. Right, we have here in the beginning of this parable, it says, verse 26, and he said, what is written in the law? What is your reading of it? And so he answered him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. How much is not included in all? Right? You are to love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind. That means that you're not allowed to love the world with any of it, with any of your mind, any of your heart, any of your strength, any of your soul. You're supposed to be loving God with all of it. Why are you loving the world with some of it? Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6, verse 17. Romans 6:17, but God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered. And having been set free from sin, you have become slaves to righteousness. So again, you used to be slaves to Satan. Now you're slaves to God. And just one more, just for fun. In Matthew chapter 10, because we're having so much fun. Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. 10:37. He who loves father or mother more, excuse me, more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Who does not take this cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Right? He who loves anything in this world more than me is not worthy of me. He who does not love me more than anything in this world is not worthy of me. What's interesting is we often talk about balance in our lives. God is not looking for balance. He's looking for sold outness. He's looking for fanatics. He's looking for slaves. So I got to just pause here and then ask that question. Does this message annoy you? Do you resent the idea that you are a slave of God? Notice what it says in verse 24 again. First it says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other. And we generally can say, okay, it's not that I hate. But then look at the second part, right? It says, or else he would be loyal to one and despise the other. I think this is the category that we often fall in, that we are loyal to the world and despise or are annoyed by God trying to say that he's in charge of everything. I don't want him to be in charge of everything. I just want him to be in charge of a few things. I want to be in charge of the rest of the things. I want to love my success and my world and my house and my family and my stuff. What's interesting is this is one of those things where we go through the motions. We speak the language of loving God, but what are we actually doing? We're actually serving the world. We're actually loving the world. And you know that scripture as well as I when Jesus when the at the end times when people come and say, hey, I did this for you, I did that for you, I did the other for you, right? And Jesus said, I never knew you. I never saw your love for me. I never knew that you loved me. I knew that you liked me. I knew that I was convenient for you, but I never saw that you loved me. There's a great story I ran into, and you may have heard this before. There was a man who had a cattle farm, and he had this cow that had two calves, and he was just so overwhelmed that he had these two calves. So he decided he was going to oh, now I can't remember the word, but he was going to give one of those calves to the Lord. He was going to say one of those were God's calves, right? He was going to give that calf to the Lord, and he was going to keep the other one. He was going to sacrifice that calf for God to show how thankful that he was. So a little while later, one of the calves dies, and he comes in to his wife. He tells his wife that the calf has died, and he says, by the way, that was the Lord's calf that died. So the story just reminds me that it goes back to the word that was used earlier about prioritization, that we often, when the push comes to shove, it's the Lord's calf that dies. It's him that gets second shrift, whatever that word is. It's him that doesn't get the priority in our lives, does not get the love, right? It's his calf that always dies when push comes to shove, not the world's calf, not the other things that are important to us. So I just challenge you with that. That is the message that he's giving us here. I do want to show you one positive statement, because I know all I've done is beat you up today. So look at Philippians chapter 4. I can't find it. I know it's in here somewhere. Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. Mine says, you know it, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. So what we've been talking about here is guarding your heart, guarding your mind, guarding your will. What's interesting is he says, if you want your hearts, your minds guarded, what do you do about it? Verse 6, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your mind. So again, it takes us right back to the beginning. Verses 1 through 18 are critical for us to get verses 19 through the end of the chapter correct. In order for us to have the right relationship with the world and to think about the world correctly, we've got to make sure that our relationship with God is not hypocritical, that our prayer life is the prayer life that he's looking for, that our fasting is the kind of fasting that he's looking for, that our good works, our good gifts are the kind of good works that he's looking for, right? And then when you get that right, the peace of God guards your heart, guards your mind, guards your will, right? God himself guards us as we interact with the world if we get our relationship with him right. So make sure your heart is in heaven and not on earth. Just think about that a minute. Make sure that your heart is in heaven and not on earth. Make sure that your mind is in heaven and not on earth. And make sure that your will is in heaven and not on earth. Lay up for yourself treasures. Do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven. Do not love the world, but love God. That's what he's trying to say. All right, any comments? That felt more like preaching than teaching. Does it make sense? Do you get it? Or am I just off to the left somewhere?
I think it was great, Rich, and one thing that kept encouraging me and coming into my mind was, it's a simple statement, so hard to really do. And I think the minute we're with the Lord, we're going to think, why was that hard to do at all? Why?
Or how stupid are we?
Yeah, gosh, it just seems hard now, but boy, we're going to one day just realize nothing should have been hard about it.
Good.
Thing is, it's hard when life is easy and life is good.
Right.
That's when it's the hardest. And, it's pretty easy to get dependent on God when you get sick or have a crisis or whatever. It's a lot easier to have faith in those times than it is when life is good and you feel like you've got it under control and doing okay by yourself. That's the scariest part of it for me.
Yeah. Satan loves that, right? He loves it when you feel good about what's going on in your life.
It's funny that that's the same. I'm on top of the world.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
I think that's how he gets a lot of unbelievers. I mean, I've said that myself about a family member. I said, he's got things so good, he has no need for God. And that's, unfortunately where a lot of people are.
Yeah. Yep. Satan's got him right where he wants him. All right. Very good. All right. Prayer requests. Stop the recording. Stop the recording.